Hi everyone, I'm Stan Mallow. Welcome to Paranormal Yacker. My guest on today's show is Julia Gordon-Bramer. She's a Sylvia Plath scholar, a professional tarot card reader, award-winning writer and poet, and former professor for the graduate writing program at Lindenwood University. I'll be talking with Julia about her book, The Occult Sylvia Plath, The Hidden Spiritual Life of the Visionary Poet. This groundbreaking book, which is the result of 15 years of in-depth research by Julia, unveils Sylvia Plath's secret life of mysticism and the occult. Julia Gordon-Bramer, welcome to Paranormal Yacker.
Thank you so much, Stan. I'm glad to be here.
What, Julia, was there about Sylvia Plath and the road she traveled in life that initially intrigued you and drew you to her and led you to want to learn and understand just about every aspect of her?
I first found her when I was 16 and I read The Bell Jar, which was the same age I found my first deck of tarot cards. I'm a professional tarot card reader, as you mentioned. I read The Bell Jar, but I was maybe a little more fascinated with the poem at the end of The Bell Jar called Mad Girl's Love Song. And that really kind of captivated me and led me into reading some of her poetry. Now, I was by no means an expert in poetry when I was 16 years old and didn't understand most of what I was reading at that age. When I was in undergraduate school, which I didn't go to college until my early 30s, I chose the getting married and having kids young route. And so in my early 30s, I went to school and Plath showed up again. And I studied her poems and again was fascinated, but can't say that I really saw anything regarding mysticism, even as a tarot card reader. It wasn't until graduate school, 2007, when I was getting my master's in fine arts in poetry and fiction. I had a situation where I started talking with one of my professors, and I said, Dr. Schreiner, I keep seeing all this tarot imagery in Plath's work, but I can't find anything on it. What's the deal? And he looked at me blankly and said, I don't know what you're talking about. And he said, You're a tarot card reader. He knew this. He used to bring me into some of his other classes to read cards for some of his students in units on mysticism and that sort of thing. And he said, Why don't you make that your semester end project? And my semester end project became my life's work. What I identified was that Plath's great collection, Ariel, was perfectly aligned with the tarot's major arcana first, and then the minor arcana ranks. And then it leaves 4 poems at the end, which she sums up the suits very nicely. She did this amazing job with Ariel. And each poem, when you understand its correspondence with the tarot, radically changes the meanings and gets her so far away from just the drama. People read Plath and they think she was just miserable, suicidal. Of course, she was. I don't doubt that. And I don't doubt that that's one interpretation to take her autobiography. However, there's so much more. And she was a genius's genius. And what my work aims to prove is that with each poem in Ariel, she had one set of words that had 6 different meanings minimum. She was touching into the arts and humanities and astrology and astronomy and alchemy and tarot and Kabbalah, and it goes on, history in the world. She was truly a master of the craft and knew how to milk words for every meaning possible. And I just don't think people know how to see this yet. I've compared myself a little bit to John the Baptist, to prepare ye the way and show everyone, look what's here, look for yourself. And I just give them the eyes to do that.
The Occult Sylvia Plath was intended to be the introduction to your first book, Fixed Stars Govern a Life, Decoding Sylvia Plath. When and why did you decide it was its own biography?
So, Fixed Stars Govern a Life, which is basically literary criticism and analysis. It's taking her poems apart line by line and sort of showing the reader what they mean. But I knew I needed an introduction that explained how Plath got to this point and why she would have any interest in doing this. So the Occult Sylvia Plath was, as you said, meant to be the introduction. It just got so wieldy and there was so much, and I kept finding more and more and more. And I realized it was its own thing. And I wrote a much briefer introduction for Fixed Stars Governor Life, which came out in 2014. After that, just continued to work on the Occult Sylvia Plath, which at the time I was calling the magician's girl after a line in one of her poems, The Bee Meeting, because she was very much mentored by her husband, Ted Hughes, who was the magician, heavily into occult and mysticism himself.
How, Julia, has the mystical side of Plath been missed in the 60 years since her death?
I mean, almost completely. People see the words. She's written about it. She's written in her journals. She's written in her letters to her mother. She's talked about the Ouija board sessions, her dreams and levitation and the tarot decks and the wanting to be the next Georgie and W.B. Yeats with her and her husband and doing automatic writing and channeling, playing with crystal balls, playing, probably said Ouija boards already, bibliomancy. I mean, she's written about all of these things, but no one has taken it seriously or collectively, which is just bizarre to me. As I said, they've done that extensively with her husband and his work, but they've kept Plath in this very narrow box of this depressive, suicidal woman as if she has no other dimension to her than that. I think it's a statement on sexism, really, among other things. The best we've labeled her is an early voice in feminism and a confessional poet, of which her husband, Ted Hughes, said, and I have the quote in the beginning of my book, she was not a confessional poet, but a mystical poet of the highest order. That was roughly what Hughes said. People just want to keep her in the view that they've always seen her. And of course, careers, academic careers, have been built on that. So I'm really upsetting the apple cart here.
Good for you on that. Now, what, Julia, makes the Occult Sylvia Plath unique from other biographies that have been written of her?
Most of those focus on the drama. They focus on the philandering husband and the depression and the suicide attempt. That's all been done to death. Somebody said to me when I was in the Plath archives once and I was walking out with all of my notebooks and my laptop, and he looked at me and he recognized that I was studying Plath and he said, "How can there be anything else to say about that woman?" And he sort of dismissed me. And I was like, "You'd be surprised." I know he didn't believe me. It's like, "Yeah, sure, right." Because that's all the biographies are, a rehash. That's where people like her. Gwyneth Paltrow and Daniel Craig, there was that movie Sylvia in the early 2000s where it was only about the drama and the depression. There was nothing about her genius and her work. That it showed writer's block, but very little about what she did and what she was capable of.
Some people say you give equal time to Plath's husband, English poet Ted Hughes, who, even though he was divorced from Sylvia at the time of her death, became executor of her estate.
Not exactly divorced. They never officially divorced.
Okay, I was under the impression they were.
And maybe that's part of the reason why. It was a very nasty breakup, and he had left her for another woman who was a friend of theirs. They had this couple friend, the Wevels, who came to visit, and he ended up having an affair with the gorgeous Aja Wevel, who looked very much like Liz Taylor. And compared to Sylvia Plath, who compared herself in a journal entry to Debbie Reynolds, which, if you know about that torrid Hollywood romance, and Plath looked a little bit like Debbie Reynolds, honestly, too. So it was a pretty good match. Ted ended up abandoning her in Ireland and running off with the girlfriend again. It all went so terribly bad because the girlfriend had a daughter with Ted Hughes, and Ted Hughes could not be faithful and he could not commit to her. And so Aja Wevel ended up committing suicide the same way Plath had and taking their daughter with her. So Ted Hughes had a lot of guilt on his conscience, paid a heavy price for breaking hearts.
Whether we like it or not, or admit it or not, our formative years and the households we grow up in have an influence on us when we become adults. That was for sure the case with Sylvia Plath. What, Julia, can you tell me about Sylvia's parents and the environment she grew up in?
Specifically regarding mysticism, her father was a Freemason, which she didn't really understand what that was until she was older, but that's a fact. Her mother got her master's degree studying Paracelsus, the famous alchemist. Plath's mother, Aurelia, has said that Sylvia read all of her school books. It's amazing. Her mother hoarded all of Plath's papers, which are in the archives, the Sylvia Plath archives in University of Indiana, Bloomington. And I've spent a lot of time there reading school papers and that sort of thing. And her Sunday school papers are even in there. And this child was studying, oh, I'm sorry, I misspoke. Her Sunday school papers are not in there, but she has a reference in her journals to her Sunday school papers that she was studying the zodiac for Sunday school. So she was getting into astrology and that sort of thing. As a teenager, we know she knew about Hermeticism and alchemy because she carved a wooden Hermetic caduceus at summer camp. And it's a beautiful object, which I am now the owner of, I'm happy to say. It has her initials SP on the handle of it. I have pictures of it on my Instagram and on my Twitter. It's gorgeous, and it's got alchemical symbols going up and down. It's basically a magic wand. Her life was full of this stuff as a young girl. She loved the gods and goddesses and mythology, and she had pictures that she drew of Athena and all of these, and she read all of the books that she could find on mysticism and the mystic poets and writers. She was just steeped in it from well before she met Ted Hughes. Ted Hughes, on his end, his mother saw and spoke to spirits. There was a lot of sort of folk magic in his family. And he, of course, was also very interested in myth. And he was a rabid Shakespeare fan and analyzed Shakespeare and the magic of Shakespeare. Believed, I think correctly, that Shakespeare was putting a spell on his work. And I think Ted Hughes learned a lot from Shakespeare and also Yeats. And Sylvia Plath, before they met, she hadn't read a lot of Shakespeare at that time, but she knew a lot of Yeats and studied him. So, and William Blake and some of the other mystics.
Plath and her husband, Ted Hughes, explored the supernatural together. And as you mentioned previously, he mentored her in many areas: meditation, crystal gazing, astrology, Kabbalah, tarot, automatic writing, magical workings, and the use of the Ouija board. Which of those did Sylvia gravitate to most, found she had an affinity for, and utilized more than the others?
Well, that's hard to say. I would have to ask her. What I can tell you is there are quite a number of occasions that she documented using the Ouija board with Ted. She wrote many times of needing to get better at tarot and better at astrology. In her famous poem, Daddy, she has this line, and my tarot pack, I may be a bit of a Jew. And people don't always understand tarot is tarot. And the Jewish references that Plath continued to use, she's been really criticized for them. People have said, who is this white bread Boston girl, kind of comparing herself with Jews in the Holocaust? She worked the meaning symbolically so it could mean that. But of course, Kabbalah goes back to ancient Jewish mysticism. And really, so many times that she has a Jewish reference, it's a Kabbalah reference. It's interesting stuff. As I said, she would take one word and work it to its maximum effect.
Your book, Julia, decodes the alchemical, Kabbalistic, Hermetic, spiritual, and tarot related references in many of Plath's poems, and you spoke about that earlier. Is it possible to give an example of one of those poems?
What I can tell you, because it's, first of all, I don't have the book in front of me, and I wrote that so many years ago, I don't have the instant recall there. But what I can tell you is that each of Plath's Ariel poems align with a tarot card. So the first poem in Ariel is Morning Song, and it aligns with the card 0, which is the Fool card. And Morning Song among other meanings, it addresses that the chemical element of lawrencium was just discovered in the news on Valentine's Day. And Plath's first words, and gosh, I don't know if I can say it off the top of my head, but the first word is love. And she gets into just I just remembered the first line. So the first line in Morning Song is love set you going like a fat gold watch. And so if you read about Lawrencium and you look at some of the pictures that came out in the news in her time, you're going to see a fat gold container thing that the scientists used to create this. And this chemical Lawrencium made on Valentine's Day, love set it going. Fascinating. At the same time, she also addresses the writer D.F. Lawrence. And she's, like I said, she's milking some meanings, and she talks about some of his work. It goes on and on. She gets into, I believe there's a Shakespeare play in there. There's a number of meanings layered into this singular poem. In a later poem, like Poppies in October, if you look at the tarot card that it aligns with, which is the Judgment card in the Rider-Waite or the Universal Waite deck, you're going to see this beautiful sky with billowing clouds, and you're going to see very lavender and all of these colors. And she names all those colors. I think Poppies in October is one of her easiest poems to match to the tarot card and really see it, whether or not you know the meaning of the tarot card. So that would be a fun thing for your visitors to do. But there's a lot of detail that I couldn't possibly cover in even an hour.
Sylvia Plath had a tumultuous marriage and committed suicide at age 30. That was a tragedy on all levels and to everyone around her, from her two children who lost their mother at an early age, to the literary community who lost one of its brightest and most influential stars. What, Julia, do you feel drove Plath to take her life at such an early age?
It was a perfect storm of a lot of terrible circumstances. So, as I said, her husband had left her and their two small children for another woman who used to be her friend. So, the ultimate betrayal there. It was the coldest, worst winter in London in 100 years. And she was snowed in. There was like 6 feet of snow, and all the pipes were frozen, and there was no heat. She's got candlelight, and she's trying to boil water out of the bathtub for her children to just have something to drink and bathe in. That was a disaster. She had this unrelenting flu that just kind of wouldn't go away. The poem Fever 103 dances around that topic, among other things. Everything was going wrong. She was not a stranger in England, but she wasn't a native. She didn't have the support system really around her. She was rather alone. She had just moved back to kind of kickstart her literary career back to London from Devon, where she had lived with Ted Hughes. Her book, The Bell Jar, had just come out to very mediocre reviews, which is laughable to think today because it continues to be a best-selling classic novel today, taught in many English classes and from high school on up. It was just this miserable combination of things that I just think beat her down until she couldn't take it anymore. And of course, she was clinically depressed and probably bipolar. She had a lot against her.
What would you, Julia, like readers of the Occult Sylvia Plath, take away with them from the book regarding Plath, her legacy, the impact she had on the literary world, and perhaps how her demons and the tragedy she suffered in life be of help to those who might find themselves dealing with situations similar to hers?
What I hope readers take away is that Plath was so much more than her drama and her suicide, and that if they learn to read her poems in context, if they understand what was happening at the times, and if they understand just a little bit, they don't have to practice mysticism. They don't have to conjure spirits. They don't have to read tarot. But if they understand just a little bit, they can see that she was working on these multiple levels. and was truly a genius's genius. That's my big message to the world. I can't let go of it. I found this and I fell down the rabbit hole, and I just could not believe that this great figure in literature has just been dissed in this way. It's the final insult to just sort of, yeah, confessional poet, hysterical, depressive. And that's how she's taught. Makes me crazy, honestly. I think it's a real statement on sexism in literature, which this is a little bit tangential, but Harold Bloom, a great well-known literary critic, just passed a couple of years ago. He has a wonderful book called something Literature in the Kabbalah or the Literary Kabbalah, something like that. Should be pretty easy to look up. And he analyzes Kabbalah used among all these great writers, but they're all male writers. And so here's the interesting thing. Harold Bloom wrote really what is only a scathing introduction about Sylvia Plath in one of the better known Plath biographies, calling her hysterical. How was it that even he, an expert in Kabbalah, who could see it in the men, was unable to see it in Plath's work? It makes me crazy. It really does. Ted Hughes saw it. I'm sure of that. I'm sure Ted Hughes probably taught it to her. But they kept it under wraps because, of course, they didn't want people to know there was a formula, which it is a very clear formula. I noticed with Ted Hughes, he sort of writes, he's a little looser with it. He would play with the Kabbalah tree of life and the system kind of starting in the middle sometimes and going forward or maybe backwards. Plath was very rigid, starting from the first, from the Fool card number 0 in order. As Ted Hughes used to say, she had this Germanic perfectionism about her. Clearly she did, and Hughes was much looser with it. But I have found it, the system of the tree of life and this ordering, it's in all of their works, certainly since they were together. And it's pretty amazing.
I don't think I'd be too far off what I'm going to say now. And if I'm wrong, please correct me. But if I said that in some ways you and Sylvia are kindred spirits, what with you both being award-winning writers and poets, both of you teaching classes at higher institutions of learning, and both having strong interest in the occult. What, Julia, is your take on what I just said?
Kindred spirits, yes. But I just want to say I am not her. I will say, and people find this interesting, I was born 9 months after she died in 1963. Plath died February 11th, 1963. I was born in November 1963. I will say I have had a lot of really interesting correspondences and signs that I'm on path and this is the work I'm meant to do, and that she's with me. And I think the greatest sign being the fact that I became the owner of her Hermetic Caduceus, which I never intended, never thought it would be possible for someone like me. Her tarot cards recently auctioned off in 2020 for over $200,000. And she didn't make those tarot cards. She made this Hermetic Caduceus. So I'm sure that this thing is more valuable than my house. And for me to have attained it, of course, it's kept locked up in a safe, but there are pictures on my Instagram if you'd like to see it, and my Twitter recently. I just feel like, yeah, we are kindred spirits. I'm here to do a job to redeem her. I think it's time. And I think we're done. These are interesting times. And I can see that feminism has really kind of risen up again in a different way. And we're looking at the paternalistic society and all of that. Maybe she chose this time to sort of shake things up and say, hey, look at me in a different way now.
I think you've done a great job with it, because I was reading a book which I absolutely loved. I couldn't help feeling, gee whiz, there's a connection there somewheres, and obviously there is. Should viewers of Paranormal Yacker want to buy the Occult Sylvia Plath, The Hidden Spiritual Life of the Visionary Poet, or any of your other books, or if you're still doing tarot readings, you are a professional tarot reader, they'd like to book a tarot reading with you, Julia, how can they do that?
They can go to my website, juliagordonbramer.com, and I can spell it real quick, JuliaGordonBramer. And they can reach me right through there for all of that. So that's probably the easiest way.
Julia Gordon-Bramer, I thank you for being my guest on Paranormal Yakker. It's been great yakking with you.
Thank you, Stan.
Hi, everyone. This is Stan Mallow, the Paranormal Yakker. I hope you enjoyed the interview you just watched. So that you don't miss any upcoming shows, be sure to subscribe to my free YouTube channel. To do that, just press the subscribe button on your screen.